This week at the agenda saw plutocrats, politicians, and property values examined, a reshuffling of Ontario's gaming industry, and alleged corruption put under the microscope. The agenda's week in review begins with the Ontario Liberal leadership race. In less than 2 months, Ontario's Liberal Party will choose a new leader. It is arguably the second hardest job in politics in Canada today. The province's economy is still sputtering, and the party itself is less popular than it was just a year ago when it won its third consecutive mandate. Let's meet the 7 candidates hoping to become the next Liberal leader of Ontario and Premier of Ontario. In alphabetical order, Eric Hoskins, he's the member for St. Paul's. Gerard Kennedy, former member for Parkdale High Park. Glenn Murray, member for Toronto Centre. Sandra Pupatello, former member for Windsor West. Charles Souza, member for Mississauga South. Harinder Thakkar, member for Mississauga Arundel, and Kathleen Wynne, the member for Don Valley West. And we're happy to welcome you 7 to TVO. Thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having us.
Couple of items of business before we start. Number 1, full disclosure. I have a 21-year-old son who has a bit of a Jones for politics, and he has decided to work in this campaign for you. So full disclosure, my kid's working for Eric Hoskins' campaign. Second of all, to the audience at home, read nothing into the color of the tie. It just happened to be the next one in row in my closet. That's it. As I look to understand the distinctions among you, I think I found one. And I want to start with you, because I think you just said nobody's been talking about jobs or the economy in the year and a half that you've been away, including Premier McGuinty and the Liberal government?
The whole bunch. And I got to tell you that when you're on the outside like I was, no one was talking about the economy. And when I started talking about the economy, people said, yeah, we want to get to that. When I went to Coburg yesterday, that's what they were talking about. And when I was on the phone last night with 17 leaders of the North, that's what they were talking about.
And the McGuinty government has not been.
You know what?
It's been a conversation about a lot of very important things for a whole bunch of reasons. Minority government, number 1. We're not used to that. I'm used to having to fight in the House because I came from opposition. And I recognize that in a minority environment, the whole world is different from the 2 terms of government that most of the folks here have had. But I was there in 1995. I was there watching what Mike Harris was doing when he had a majority government. He wasn't talking about jobs either, but the economy was flourishing.
Okay, let's get some feedback.
Well, I think the reality is we wouldn't have recovered 130% of the jobs that we lost before the downturn if we hadn't been talking about jobs in the economy. We absolutely have been. And the Southwest Ontario Development Fund, the Eastern Ontario Development Fund that we've put in place have created jobs, have put in place support for business. So we absolutely have been talking about jobs.
I think the media government has to at least get credit for the fact there's been 2 recoveries that it accomplished. And I've been out for longer, for the last 5.5 years, but essentially there was a recovery from Mike Harris, and that was in public services and in modernizing and putting us somewhere else and where we had to be on energy, on education, on a bunch of things. And then there's a recovery from the recession. So, Senator, it's not quite fair to say that jobs, I think jobs were an obsession for the government. I think if you look at what we're doing in the North, look what we're doing in agriculture and so on, what's missing is a way to pull all that together in a way that meets what Mr. Drummond's talking about, which is transformational. Transformational isn't just running better government services, it's how do we inspire our business leaders for, whether you call it dead cash or not, whether it's money that isn't being employed. We still have a lot of young people, a lot of people who are in temporary or in uncertain jobs. That's where we have to be laser beam on. So I don't think it's not about talk, it's about translating some of that into a more focused plan in a way that engages the wider business community and the wider Ontario community.
Well, and it's not only that we've recovered 130% of the jobs that we've lost, which is much better than the situation in the United States, but also those are good, high-paying jobs. 80% of them are full-time jobs. But what we haven't done enough of, perhaps, is if you're over the age of 25, the unemployment rate is less than 6% now, which is actually, it's come down below the level it was before the recession. Unless you happen to be under the age of 25, then that unemployment rate, when you include those young persons under 25 who are no longer looking for employment, it's almost 20%. So almost 1 out of every 5 of our young people in this province aren't able to find jobs. We have the best education system in the English-speaking world. We have the highest level of participation in the OECD and the industrialized countries in terms of the participation in postgraduate education. But then for some reason we seem to hit a wall. And I know it's a global circumstance, partly, but what I'm calling it a crisis. We need to invest in our young people, our young entrepreneurs, making sure they're getting the skills that they need.
The allegation from your colleague here is that you guys haven't talked jobs in the economy enough in the past couple of years.
You know, over the last, certainly last 5 years since I've been there, we have been concentrating on our economic recovery after the recession, and we've done a good job in terms of bringing back those jobs. In fact, it was our government that stepped up to the plate, the only sub-jurisdiction in North America, to help the automotive industry. Others called it corporate welfare, but we protected over 400,000 jobs. And what we need to do now going further is increase that attraction of investment into Ontario. We are the second or third now largest jurisdiction in North America, in the world for that matter, for that investment, and the retention rate here is very high. What we need to do is look at secondary manufacturing. We need to do more processing in Ontario and branding of Ontario to the world markets.
Glenn Murray?
So I'm still not hearing a plan. So I agree. I don't agree with Sandra. Bailing out the auto sector, which you were part of, and I think was one of the best things. One of the reasons I ran 3 years ago was because of the legacy of this government, which I'm very proud of. I wish I had been part of it the way that Harinder and Kathleen. I think we should all be very proud of that. We turned this economy around coming out of 2008 like none other, and we fought the opposition parties who disagreed with us. So the question for us now is, where do we go next? Because the next thing we do is not bail out the auto sector again. So what you do? So 4.4% of companies now are generating almost 50% of their jobs. And they're generating the jobs that Eric is talking about because it's young people. These are 19 to 25-year-olds who are starting these companies. So I put out a policy yesterday, which I'm hoping I'd love to debate, which basically says it'll bring in $2 billion of additional tax revenue, reduce the tax on high-risk capital that you need to fuel these companies because they burn through capital, and provoke all that dead capital, Mark Carney is out there, to get it working to create businesses in Cornwall and small towns across that and our big cities. So I'm hoping that, what I bring to this is a competency and understanding of this new economy. I think we did the right things in 2003 and 2008. I'm proposing the things we need to do in 2013. And I think if we do this, we'll be able to bring our deficit down faster and grow companies faster.
You say that you have led a recovery that is among the best in North America, and part of the cost of doing that is a deficit which is now clocking in at $14.4 billion. I understand you felt you had to make those investments in order to help turn things around, but now we got to do something about that. I think you're the one candidate who is talking about balancing the budget a year ahead of everybody else.
Yes, sir.
And I think we need to understand how you plan to do that.
Yeah, let me tell you, I think it is really important for us to balance the budget as quickly as we can. I think that there are a couple of reasons for it. If we want to attract foreign direct investment in this province, and if we don't balance the budget, we will stifle the economy. So I'm proposing 3 measures on that front. One is that we have to make this economy grow. How can we make this economy grow is I'm proposing a 100-day plan in which we will focus on actually helping our small business to really grow. We will help them by having a holistic approach which will focus on increasing productivity, providing them the access to the capital that we need to provide them, but also helping them to actually open the global markets. I was in Markham yesterday at Nova Plastic. You were there before me. I mean, you talk to this person, he has come up with an excellent idea to actually penetrate the global market, but he needs some assistance from the government to do that. The second is we also need to assist people who create jobs in this province. That's why I'm proposing that we should give them an employment tax credit.
Never mind the 1%, let's talk about the 0.1%, the wealthiest of the wealthy, modern-day plutocrats, whose exorbitant wealth sets them apart from everyone else, not just in terms of how much money they have, but also in how much political power they wield the world over. Joining us now for more on this, Chrystia Freeland. We know, just from the cover of your book alone, that these are people who park their executive jets on their driveways and, live this incredible lifestyle, obviously, that the rest of us can only imagine. But do they have daily impact on the lives of average Americans, Canadians, citizens of the world, by being who they are?
Absolutely. I mean, one of the reasons, maybe the main reason to write this book was my belief that the consequence of this rising income inequality, the result of those income numbers, of that data that we can see, is a society in which this 1%, this 0.1% has growing economic power, and therefore, that power inevitably translates into social and political power. And that's something that I think we need to be aware of, we need to think about, we need to not be afraid to talk about.
Is it your sense that the average American, therefore, hates this group of plutocrats because of the exalted position they have in American society?
Not at all. And actually, the American way of thinking and talking about this, I think, is really interesting, and I think it has been changing. I would say that over the past 3 decades, really since the Reagan era, the collective attitude to questions of class and money and distribution of income in the United States has been that that's the wrong way to think about things. that how you want to think about the economy is you want to think about growing the whole pie. You want to think about a tide that lifts all boats. You want to think about trickle down. And that's a very comfortable, kind of wonderful, benign way to think about things. You know, it's going to be win-win. Things are going to be great for everybody. The problem is that when you look at what is actually happening in the economy, and actually particularly in the US economy, particularly over the past decade, you've had this very striking phenomenon where, on the one hand, the people at the very, very top have been getting richer than ever. Warren Buffett pointed out just this week that if you look at the 400 richest Americans, as identified by Forbes, over the past 20 years, their wealth has quintupled. It's gone up 5 times. Meanwhile, if you look at the average middle-class American, wages there have stagnated. And, you know, stunning evidence of that was some data that we got over the summer that showed, you know, certainly for the first time in my memory, the wealth of the average Canadian is now higher than the wealth of the average American. Like, wow, they really have been treading water, the American middle class.
The clock is ticking. The U.S. government has until midnight, December 31st, to address its so-called fiscal cliff, the nickname given to a $500 billion time bomb of spending cuts and tax increases that will automatically kick in, potentially sending the economy into another tailspin. Joining us now to tell us what it all means, Don Cox. He's strategy advisor with BMO Financial Group, and we're delighted to have you up here in the studio. Normally we've got you on the line from Chicago, so it's good to see you here. I gave a bit of a definition of what the fiscal cliff is there in that introduction, but do you want to put a little more meat on that bone?
Well, what it is a sign of the total breakdown of their governmental system, their ability to deal with budgets. Because the rule is that all tax policy must originate in the House of Representatives. The President is supposed to send a budget which goes to the Senate and the House. Obama issued no budgets for 3 years at all, and then sent one which was voted down 79 to nothing in the Senate.
He got no votes even from his own party on that.
Yeah. So there had been no budget process in a real sense. So in a desperation, they came up with a scheme whereby if they couldn't reach agreement by this date, that they would sequester $1.5 trillion of expenditures. Half which is going to be taken out of defense, and the rest was domestic programs. The idea was the Republicans would be too horrified at the defense cuts, and the Democrats would be too upset by cuts to social programs, so therefore they would reach an agreement. That was what they came up with.
So it's sort of like a doomsday machine.
That's right. And so you can think of it actually as that it's sort of like Cinderella's ball. We're coming up to midnight, but the bad sisters can't fit into the shoes. All right? And there may be a good sister out there, but we haven't found her yet. And therefore, everybody's going to turn into a pumpkin at midnight.
Well, let's continue the metaphor. How hard are they looking for this one sister in whose foot, or on whose foot that slipper will fit?
Well, Obama has decided he is it. He has decided that he has a mandate from the election. And so what he's proposed to them is something that is, as Speaker Boehner says, an insult. It includes an increase in stimulus spending at a time when the Republicans were overwhelmingly elected in the House, and of the majority in the House, overwhelmingly they were elected by a bigger margin in their district than Obama got nationally. So they're saying, under the Constitution, we have budget responsibilities. We were elected by people who told us to cut spending.
What kind of impact does that have on Canada?
Very serious. Roughly 37% of Canada's GDP is trade with the U.S. And so not only does it affect the trade you think of, you know, cars and all that, it's certainly going to affect things like the Stratford Festival, the Shaw Festival, Canadian vacation properties and so forth, because Americans will have less money to come in. And the other thing is the Canadian dollar will strengthen against the U.S. dollar, because the currency of a country which manages itself well is worth more than the country that mismanages its currency. No good deed goes unpunished in the currency markets. Now that Canadian dollar is included legally in foreign exchange reserves as against the yen, the pound, or the U.S. dollar, there would be a big climb into the Canadian dollar, driving it up higher, so that the effects on the Canadian economy could be quite severe. The U.S. is really in a much worse fiscal situation than people realize. If they did their counting the way we do for Canada pension plan in Canada, I'm a Canadian still, then they would see that the debt outstanding in the U.S. is 100% of GDP, which is roughly that of Italy. But they only count the debt that's held by the public, which means the debt that's held in the Social Security Trust Fund, the Military Trust Fund, the Highways Trust, doesn't count. And therefore they say we've got all this room. They don't.
So if you included all of the outstanding debt,
yeah,
it's off the charts.
And they're proposing, you see, Obama has added more than $1 trillion in debt each year. He's increased the national debt by 60% in 4 years in office. That's some kind of record breaking. And he's proposing to do it again. And the Republicans are saying, we were elected to stop that. And he's saying, I have a bigger mandate than you have because your popularity, as I go to the polls, is 23%, and I got a 53% vote. Let's fight.
What led you to the conclusion in your report that the presence of a casino in Toronto would lead to a prevalence of problem gambling in this city?
Well, in this report, we worked closely with the Problem Gambling Research Group at the Centers for Addiction and Mental Health and looked at all of the science, all the research that's been done on gambling and problem gambling, both in Canada and in other countries. And there's a very clear relationship between how convenient it is to gamble and the proportion of the population who are going to be problem gamblers. So more access means more problem gambling.
Here's another quote from the report. It is noteworthy that access to gambling is already increasing in many ways. The Canadian Senate is currently considering Bill C-290, which would legalize single-event sports betting. Automated gambling machines are being installed in many bingo halls in the province. The availability of online gambling is also increasing at a rapid rate, including the launch of the OLG iGambling site. That's set for the year 2013. If gambling is everywhere, as you seem to indicate that it is, what difference would the presence of a casino really make?
Well, people often say that. If you can gamble on your home computer, what difference does it make if there's a casino down the road? Well, it turns out it does make a difference. Internet gambling, although it's widely available, turns out to be one of the least common forms of gambling, at least the kind that lead to problem gambling. Most problem gamblers that seek clinical treatment, for example, have trouble with slot machines and table games, exactly the kind of things that you find in a casino. And the closer to a casino, the more convenient it is, the more likely people are to gamble in a way that causes health problems.
David Letterman's got his top 10 list. Shall we share your top 10 list with the viewers?
Sure.
You know what's on this, but if a casino does come to Toronto, you have recommended the following. Number 1, limiting the hours of the casino operation, making sure it's closed for at least 6 hours per day. Number 2, restricting the number of electronic gaming machines, i.e. slots, and slowing down machine speed of play and features that promotes false beliefs of the odds of winning. Number 3, eliminating the casino loyalty programs. Number 4, prohibiting ATMs on the gambling floor. Number 5, prohibiting casino credit and holding accounts. 6, reducing maximum bet size. 7, mandating a daily loss maximum. 8, implementing strong casino self-exclusion programs, like a mandatory player card system. 9, issuing monthly individual patron statements. These would allow patrons to see how their personal record of loss, frequency, and duration of play compares to the average customer. And finally, number 10, designating areas for alcohol purchase and not providing alcohol service on casino floors to reduce impaired judgment. Most of these, I suspect, are pretty self-explanatory, but there was one that caught my eye here. Mandatory player card system. What does that mean?
Well, it means that if you go to a casino, if you want to gamble, you actually have to have a card with your identity on it. The advantages of mandatory card systems is it helps the casino run its self-exclusion program, so you can be identified as a person who has decided not to be allowed into a casino if you make that decision. It also allows the casino and researchers to gather a lot of information about who's gambling and how much gambling they're doing and who's getting into trouble.
Is there any concern that you have, again, going by the data of the Canadian Gaming Association, that if you implement or were to implement the measures that you've suggested, you might actually perversely incent people to gamble more quickly so that they can get done what they need to get done in the reduced hours of operations and so on and so forth?
Well, the mitigation measures that I've suggested include not only restricting access by not having casinos open 24 hours a day, but also putting in place measures to limit the damage that problem gamblers can do to themselves and their finances, such as reducing maximum bets, having a maximum spending limit per day. Those can only be implemented with a mandatory player card system, which is why it's on the list.
But they say it's 1% of the population. And there's no point in restricting something that 99% of the people do, in their view, okay, because 1% of the population have a problem with it. What do you say to that?
Well, it's a little bit like alcohol. Most people who go into a bar for a drink will leave the bar and drive home without killing anybody drunk driving. However, it's worthwhile putting some measures in place to limit the harm that happens. So we teach servers of alcohol not to serve people who are already drunk, for example. So we can put in place measures which don't impair people from actually going out and gambling safely, but will limit the damage for those people who are prone to problem gambling.
We've still got a bar on every corner of this city.
That's true.
If we have a casino in this city, it's going to be the end of the world?
It won't be the end of the world, but it'll increase access to gambling, and more people will suffer harm. There'll be more broken families, more people who kill themselves, more people with depression.
Ontario used to have a program called Slots at Racetracks. It was a vital source of income to the horse tracks and breeders' business. But it cost taxpayers $345 million a year. And so when the McGuinty government canceled the program, saying it was too expensive in an era of austerity, the industry was apoplectic, claiming it couldn't survive without that money. Queen's Park appointed 3 former Ontario cabinet ministers, one from each of the major parties, to look at this, and those 3 appointees join us now. I want to start by reading something that comes from your report, and then we'll discuss from there. So if we can, control room. The panel has scanned the global equine sector and cannot find a single example of a viable racehorse industry that does not depend on some form of public support. Where that support has been withdrawn, the industry inevitably collapses. Okay, let's start there. I'm going to start with the horse guy. You're in the Rodeo Hall of Fame, aren't you? So
yeah, everybody gets somewhere.
So I'm going to start with the guy who owns the horses. Why does this, what we apparently think of as a big, rich private business, need taxpayer support?
You know, first there's a lot of competition now, both from the entertainment point of view and also from the gaming point of view. So there's more competition than ever for those gaming dollars. The racehorse industry going back to the beginning. You know, the Queen's Plates, 157, I think, years old this year, something in that order. Those 50 guineas came from somewhere that started that race. So there's always been support of the racing industry going back generations and generations and generations, and it's built on that public support.
John Wilkinson, if this industry is not economically viable on its own, should we let nature take its course?
Well, some jurisdictions have actually done that, Steve. But I think what governments come to realize and society comes to realize is the fact that it generates a lot of jobs. And so the question is it in the public good? So what the 3 of us looked at is what is the appropriate relationship between the industry and the government in the public good? And so we wrote an interim report where we agreed what were the kind of the 4 principles that would determine whether or not the industry should have support. The industry was very loud. They said, we're not subsidized. We don't want to be subsidized. And we looked at it, and we looked at it from a provincial point of view. The amount of money going in was more than the amount of money coming back by way of taxes. But we said in our report, now if that was a positive rate of return, then it wouldn't be a subsidy, it'd be an investment. And I think most progressive jurisdictions that support their horse racing industry see it as an investment, but it should never be subsidized.
What do these racetracks all around Ontario mean to the communities in which they are located, Elmer?
Well, most of the tracks, of course, are in rural Ontario, although there's one in Rexdale that people would argue is not really rural. But
that'd be Woodbine, I guess, eh?
That would probably be Woodbine, yes. No, they certainly provide jobs, and in many cases they're low-skilled jobs. They're not college or university-educated jobs. So it provides an opportunity for people who don't have that formal education to work with animals, which is something a lot of people enjoy. So yeah, there are a lot of jobs, and there's a lot of economic churn in the horse industry, because the old system with slots and so on provided a lot of good purse money, which allowed people to buy trailers and invest in horses and infrastructure and so on. So it has generated a lot of economic activity and jobs in rural Ontario.
As we watch what goes on in the province of Quebec, there may be a tendency by people here in the province of Ontario to feel somewhat smug, saying, oh boy, there's Quebec living up to all the worst stereotypes we think about it. However, get comfortable, everybody, I've got a bit of a list here. The MFP inquiry didn't take place all that long ago in the city of Toronto. Mayor Rob Ford's conflict of interest issue is now before the courts. Hazel McCallion, the mayor of Mississauga, had an issue related to a development and her son. This time, And I think about 25 years ago, she was involved in another conflict of interest situation when she was the mayor of Streetsville. Harinder Thakkar is seeking the leadership of the Ontario Liberals right now. He was found to be in a conflict of interest, trying to deal with his personal family business while it was supposedly in a blind trust, and he was a cabinet minister at the time. Question, Guy, can we really be all that smug about this here in the province of Ontario?
I don't think we should be smug about this in the province of Ontario. It can happen anywhere, and it does happen anywhere, not just in Ontario and Quebec, but in other provinces as well, and at all levels. Absolutely not. And as much as we might point to some things in Quebec, it's actually true that in many respects, Quebec has stronger rules and more enforcement of various ethical codes than Ontario does, and certainly than the federal government does. So they are, while they're dealing with certain challenges right now in terms of legal framework and legal enforcement, they are national leaders in accountability and ethics.
Although Ontario, I think, was the first person to put in an ethics commissioner, right? This is going back to the late 1980s?
Provincially.
Yes. Provincially.
That's right. That's right. And it was only a year ago that Quebec put into place a similar type of ethics commissioner, though they had a different sort that was in effect in 2002. But I agree with Guy that I've looked at the ethics scandals across Canada, federally, provincially, and municipally.
Who's the juiciest?
And
come on.
Well, it changes from period to period. I mean, during Gomery, it was the federal government that was the worst, and Oliphant, and then, but we had a series of ethics scandals in Ontario in the late 1980s. And Alberta has had some pretty serious scandals too, currently and then in the past. So it depends from one period to another. But my impression is, and this is just an impression, that there are more scandals at the municipal level than the provincial or federal level. And this is because there are more municipalities. There are tens of thousands across the country.
Right.
Most municipal politicians are extremely honest, but there's more of a chance for municipal politicians to get into trouble. And municipally in Ontario, we only have, I think, we have fewer than 20 independent ethics commissioners in the municipalities, and thousands of municipalities. So, you know, education is the key to preventing conflicts of interest and corruption.
And if I go back, I think maybe it's 20, 25 years now, I mean, the Conservative Party of Saskatchewan doesn't exist anymore.
You're right.
Because people went to jail.
Exactly.
They were hip deep in the corruption there.
Extremely good example.
Yeah, so one of the senators went to jail. All right, well, let's try this.
It can happen anywhere, Steve, as Guy points out. And if we're talking about the province of Quebec, the other side of the coin is that they're very, very serious about getting to the bottom of what's happening, and that's clear from the Charbonneau Commission. Indeed, there are complaints about the Charbonneau Commission being too zealous and sweeping up too many people in it.
But let me also add that with respect to Quebec, the question is whether or not matters were so secret there, or whether indeed there were a lot of people in the know and had been for a very long time. And that'll be one of the questions the Charbonneau Commission is going to have to deal with.
You think the latter?
Why, yes. Why did these matters not become matters of public interest before now?
Because it was in no one's interest except the public's to have them come out.
Perhaps.
Did I say that out loud? Okay. What is MPAC and what do you guys do?
Well, we're the Municipal Property Assessment Corporation, and we're responsible for establishing a value on all the properties of Ontario, and that facilitates the distribution of the revenue requirements for municipalities across the property base in Ontario.
Just residential properties?
All types of properties. We deal with residential, we deal with farms, multi-residential, industrial, commercial, utilities, all of the different property types in the province.
Those 80-story towers downtown, you're doing those
Absolutely.
as well?
The bank towers, shopping centers, strip malls, all of those types of facilities.
What's driving residential increases?
Demand. Well, I think we were fortunate, quite honestly, in Canada in terms of the market softening that occurred certainly much more dramatically in the United States. We have had, as certainly everyone is aware, a very strong fiscal policy that's allowed lending to continue at a fairly aggressive rate. And the demand for homes continues to increase in Ontario.
Bubbles. How do you deal with housing bubbles?
Well, I think again, our model is that we come up with a valuation on a specific date. That date is determined by legislation, and we proceed to put a value on property at that time. So if there's a bubble that occurs or some sort of change that occurs in between our assessment dates, we'll reflect that change by looking at the sales that occur, and that'll come up in the next reassessment. But again, people have to recall again that we're a distribution mechanism, we're an allocation mechanism. So we're allowing a standardized and fair mechanism for distribution. So if a bubble occurs, if it entirely affects the entire market, then the entire market would drop. It wouldn't change the allocation mechanism necessarily in that regard.
No, but I mean, you hear this all the time. We hear this all the time. If you set the value at the top of the market, then somehow the market crashes, but your assessment was made at the top of the market, and you're stuck with a higher tax rate than you otherwise you think is fair for the next 4 years. Do you revisit those kinds of situations?
No, we're not allowed to under legislation.
So how do people feel like they are justly treated under those circumstances then?
Because everyone on that valuation date, in this instance, January 1st, 2012, was being treated fairly. So everyone was treated under the same circumstance at that time, and everyone will be treated under the same circumstance when we reassess again in 2016.
Okay. If you do market value assessments, which you do you go back, say, 4 or 8 or 12 years later and actually look and see how accurately you got it, and whether, in fact, what the house sold for all those years later was what the value that you appraised it at?
So we constantly monitor sales. In fact, for residential properties, it's the primary method for us valuing properties. So there's approximately between 400 and 500,000 sold properties every year in the province. We collect that entire inventory. We have access to that entire inventory on an annual basis. We analyze the sales information because we know what the consideration amount was. We compare it to the condition and characteristics of the property, and then we build this model that predicts the value. One of the measures we actually have as to the strength of our model is what we refer to as an assessment to sales ratio. And we take a look at the predicted value on a property and we compare it to the sold value. And so we are constantly monitoring, in fact, this assessment to sales ratio.
And how close are you getting?
Our normal model is to be pretty close to 1, and we're normally within 1% on average within the province.
Antony Vishnofsky, it's awfully good of you to visit us here at TVO today. He's the president and CAO of MPAC. Thanks a lot.
Thanks very much.
And that is the Agenda's Week in Review. You can see all of those programs in their entirety on our website. That's theagenda.tvo.org, or on our iTunes channel, or on our YouTube channel. That's youtube.com/theagenda.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.